The ocean is a vast and endless mystery, a place where the unknown thrives, where nightmares take shape beneath the waves. For centuries, sailors have whispered about the strange and the impossible. Ships that vanish without a trace, islands that call out to the lost, and waters that seem to hunger for the living. Some stories can be explained. Others should have never been told. Tonight, we dive deep into the 3 most chilling ocean mysteries that will haunt your dreams. A ship that disappeared for a century, only to return with something not of this world. A cursed island where the tide itself whispers your name, and those who hear it are never seen again. And the most terrifying of all, the legend of the drowned ones, spirits of the lost who do not rest, and who drag the living down with them. The sea does not forget, and neither will you. Subscribe now so you don't miss interesting stories in future. Welcome to the darkest mysteries of the ocean. The ghost ship of the void. The sea has always held its secrets. A vast, endless abyss stretching beyond the horizon, hiding stories that defy explanation. Some call it a graveyard, others a gateway, an open wound between the living and the dead. But among all the horrors whispered by sailors, none is as terrifying as the legend of the void. It was an ordinary night in 1912 when the SS Valkyrie, a grand merchant ship, vanished without a trace. Bound for the Americas with a full crew and valuable cargo, it sailed into the Atlantic and simply ceased to exist. No distress signals, no debris, no survivors, just an empty void where it once was. For 100 years, the Valkyrie was nothing more than a ghost story, a cautionary tale for those who dared to cross the deep. But then, in 2012, something impossible happened. A cargo vessel en route to Europe sent a distress call. Their voices were frantic, filled with terror. They had found a ship, one that should not exist. When the Coast Guard arrived, what they saw defied all logic. Floating in the still, black water was the SS Valkyrie, pristine, untouched by time, as if it had just been built. The ship's name was still etched into the hull. The paint had not chipped. The wooden deck gleamed under the moonlight, completely intact. It was as if the ship had been frozen in time. But there was something deeply wrong. The crew that boarded the Valkyrie never made it back. The radio transmissions started as whispers, low murmurs, static breaking in between words. Then came the screams. Horrified, blood-curdling wails before the signal abruptly cut off. When a second team was sent, they found the first crew's bodies piled at the ship's entrance, their faces contorted in expressions of pure terror. The strange part? Not a single drop of blood was found. The Valkyrie was empty. No signs of struggle. No traces of violence. Just the overwhelming sensation of being watched. The air was thick, humid, yet icy cold at the same time. The walls seemed to whisper, the wood groaning under an unseen force. Then they found the journal. A leather-bound book, perfectly preserved, lying open on the captain's desk. The last entry was dated April 12, 1912, the night the ship disappeared. The ink had barely dried, as if it had been written just moments ago. But the words inside, they made no sense. The sea is wrong. It is no longer water. It is black, endless, devouring everything. We have crossed into something else. Something that should not be. The stars are moving. They whisper, but I cannot understand them. We are not alone. We were never alone. Something is inside the ship. It knows my name. We should have never set sail. We should have never. The entry ended abruptly, the ink trailing off into jagged scratches. Then the search party heard it. A low, wet dragging sound coming from below deck. Slow, heavy, rhythmic, like something moving. Something that had been waiting. Something that was never meant to return. April 12, 1912. The night the SS Valkyrie vanished. The voyage had been uneventful at first. Captain Edgar Holloway, a seasoned sailor with 20 years of experience, led his crew across the Atlantic with confidence. The ship carried fine silks, spices, and expensive machinery, cargo meant for trade in the New World. The weather was calm, the skies clear. Nothing seemed amiss. But then, just past midnight, the ocean changed. The first to notice was first mate Daniel Reeves, who had been charting their course. He stared at the water beneath them, his fingers gripping the railing tight. Something was wrong. The sea was no longer blue. It had turned a deep, ink-like black, stretching out endlessly in every direction. It didn't reflect the stars. It didn't ripple. It was still, unnaturally still, like a giant abyss had opened beneath them. Reeves called for the captain. Holloway arrived on deck, his brows furrowing as he took in the sight. "Is there oil in the water?" he asked. "A spill," but oil floated. This sank. A deckhand, young Thomas Graves, hesitantly dipped a rope into the water to test it. When he pulled it back up, the end of the rope was gone, severed cleanly, as if something had sliced through it. That was when they noticed the stars. Above them, the sky had shifted. The constellations had changed. Orion was missing. The North Star flickered in and out of existence. And worst of all, the stars were moving, not drifting like celestial bodies. They were crawling. "What in God's name?" Holloway whispered, stepping back. The air had grown dense, thick with something unseen. The world around them was dead silent. No wind, no waves, just the slow, deliberate movement of the stars above. Then came the knocking. A deep, resonating sound. Faint at first, but steady. Knock, knock, knock. From beneath the deck. The crew froze. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came again. But this time it wasn't alone. Something was answering. From the hull, from the captain's quarters, from the storage below. It was as if the ship itself was alive. The knocking spread, echoing through the corridors, growing in intensity until it wasn't knocking anymore. It was scratching. Something inside the walls. Panic set in. Reeves and two other men rushed below deck with lanterns, their footsteps echoing through the dim corridors. The wood beneath their boots creaked, groaning like an old house settling in the night. Then they saw it. Down the main hallway, near the storage room, the wooden panels bulged outward. The walls twisted, expanding unnaturally as if something on the other side was pushing against them. The wood splintered in places, dark fluid oozing through the cracks. And then, a handprint. A massive, elongated handprint pressed from the inside of the wall, its fingers too long, its nails too sharp. Then another, and another. Dozens of hands emerged, pressing, clawing, trying to break through. Reeves stumbled back, his lantern flickering violently. Back to the deck. Now, the crew turned, running up the stairs just as a horrific wailing sound tore through the ship. It was high-pitched, unnatural, as if the wood itself was screaming. The lanterns shattered. The temperature dropped instantly, their breath turning into mist. Then the lights went out. Captain Holloway stood frozen on the main deck, his knuckles white around the ship's wheel. He was trying to steer, but the ocean was no longer water. It had become something else, thicker, darker. It clung to the sides of the ship, pulling it downward ever so slightly. His crew were vanishing. One by one, they disappeared into the darkness, their screams cut short before they could finish. Graves collapsed onto the deck, his legs missing, not severed, but gone, like they had never existed in the first place. He reached out, his eyes wide with terror, before he, too, faded into nothing. Then, the whispering started. Holloway turned. The ship was no longer his. Figures stood in the mist, tall, faceless things with elongated limbs and too many joints. They whispered in voices not meant for human ears. And then, Holloway understood. They had sailed too far. Beyond the veil. Beyond where man was meant to go. The ocean was not an ocean. It was a threshold. A door to something endless. A final thought crossed his mind before the ship was swallowed whole. We should have never set sail. The search party aboard the rediscovered SS Valkyrie stood in stunned silence as they finished reading the captain's final log entry. Then came the sound. A low, wet dragging noise from below deck. They weren't alone. Something had returned with the ship. The search team aboard the SS Valkyrie stood frozen. The old, leather-bound logbook rested on the captain's desk, its final, frantic entries still burned into their minds. We should have never set sail. Then the sound came again. A slow, wet dragging noise, slithering through the ship's hollow corridors. It wasn't footsteps. Footsteps had weight. Footsteps had rhythm. This was something else. The lead investigator, a man named Jonas Carter, swallowed hard, gripping the flashlight in his trembling hand. "Did you hear that?" His voice barely rose above a whisper, but the look in his eyes told them all that he already knew the answer. "Yes," one of the others, Miller muttered. "I heard it." They were not alone. The air had changed. The warmth of their own breath disappeared, replaced by an unnatural cold that seeped into their bones. The walls of the ship groaned, as if the Valkyrie itself was breathing. The wood, once sturdy beneath their feet, now felt soft, as if something beneath the surface was pressing upward. A scream erupted from the far end of the hallway. One of their men, Rodriguez, had wandered ahead, his flashlight now flickering wildly as he backed toward them. "Some things," he choked, but he never finished. The lights cut out. Pitch black. Then shuffling. Soft at first, barely noticeable over the sound of their own terrified breaths. But then it grew, more pronounced, closer. Like feet dragging across the floor, but wrong. Too many feet. Jonas' pulse pounded in his ears. He turned his flashlight back on. Rodriguez was gone. In his place was a single, wet footprint, far larger than any human foot. It shimmered in the pale light, the liquid black and thick, like crude oil. But it moved. The stain pulsed, stretching outward in unnatural patterns, like fingers reaching, grasping. "We need to go. Now." Miller didn't wait for agreement. He turned and ran, the others stumbling after him. Their footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, the darkness chasing them, something lurking just beyond the edge of their lights. Then came the whispers. Not from their radios. Not from each other. From the ship itself. Soft at first, unintelligible, but growing louder with every step they took. "Turn back. You do not belong here. Leave before it wakes." Jonas' breath hitched. He had heard many strange things in his years investigating abandoned vessels, but this was different. These voices were not echoes. They were aware. The crew burst onto the main deck, gasping for air. The ocean stretched out before them, black and endless, as if the ship was floating in nothingness. That was when they saw it. The stars had moved. Just like in the captain's final entry, the constellations above were wrong. The familiar shapes of the night sky were gone, replaced by swirling patterns that shifted as they watched. And then something rose from the water. A hand. A massive, impossible hand. Its fingers long and jagged, the skin dark and glistening, as if made of liquid shadow. It pressed against the side of the ship, and the wood creaked in protest. A second hand followed. Then the head emerged. There was no face, just a black, hollow expanse, absorbing all light, shifting, watching without eyes. It opened its mouth, and the ship screamed. Not the creature, the ship itself. The Valkyrie let out a deep, agonized wail as if it were alive, as if it was begging for release. The entire structure lurched, and Jonas fell to his knees, gripping the railing as the deck tilted violently. "We need to go," Miller yelled. He was already at the emergency raft, fumbling with the ropes, trying to lower it into the water. Jonas turned. "Rodriguez." "He's gone," Miller shouted. "We have to." The ship groaned. A fissure split down the center of the deck. A deep gaping wound, as if something beneath was tearing it apart from the inside. And then the arms pulled. The ship lurched downward, dragged by unseen forces. The ocean, once still, began to swirl, pulling the Valkyrie back into the abyss. Jonas didn't hesitate. He ran, lunging for the raft just as the deck beneath him gave way. The ship was sinking, no, not sinking, being pulled under. Jonas hit the raft hard, Miller yanking him inside as the small boat plunged into the churning waves. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The water stilled. The wind silenced. The world became eerily calm. Jonas turned back. The Valkyrie was gone. Nothing remained. Not even a ripple. Just black water stretching endlessly beneath the silent sky. Jonas collapsed against the raft, his breath ragged. "Where did it go?" he whispered. Miller, pale and shaking, didn't answer. He only stared upward, at the sky. Jonas followed his gaze, and his stomach dropped. The stars had returned to normal. The constellations were back, Orion shining brightly above them, exactly where it should be. They were back. But that meant... Jonas turned his gaze downward, toward the black water below. Somewhere beneath them, far beyond what they could see, the Valkyrie was still there. Still waiting. Still listening. And whatever had come back with it wasn't done. Jonas and Miller were rescued 2 days later, drifting aimlessly in the Atlantic. They tried to explain what happened, but the Coast Guard dismissed their claims. No records of the SS Valkyrie's return existed. No distress calls. No search parties. Nothing. As far as the world was concerned, the Valkyrie never came back at all. But Jonas knew better. Late at night, when the world was quiet, he could still hear it. The sound of something knocking. Knock. 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 Beneath the floorboards. Beneath the ocean. Waiting. But the horrors of the ocean do not end here. Because sometimes, the water doesn't just hide its secrets. Sometimes it speaks. And when it does, it whispers names, calling out to those who dare to listen. But be warned, those who hear the call of the tide are never seen again. Now the story of the Screaming Tide. The village of Black Hollow sat on the edge of a violent, unpredictable sea. No maps recorded its presence. No tourists ever stumbled upon it. To the outside world, it simply didn't exist. The town's weathered wooden houses clung to the cliffs like desperate fingers, their foundations creaking under the weight of an ocean wind that never seemed to stop howling. At night, the tide was the loudest thing in the world. But it wasn't the usual crashing of waves or the roar of the wind through the cliffs. It was screaming, not the distant wails of seabirds, not the howling wind playing tricks. The ocean itself, the tide screamed. Every night, as the water crept up the shore, the screams would begin. The voices were inhuman, layered, suffering. It sounded as though an entire city was drowning just beyond the cliffs. The people of Black Hollow never spoke of it. They simply obeyed the rules. And never go near the water after dark. And never fish beyond the shallow bay. And never, ever answer when the ocean calls your name. For centuries, the villagers endured the screams, never questioning their origins. Until one man, Jonas Wren, a stranger to Black Hollow, arrived with no respect for old rules. Jonas was a journalist, an outsider, a man who believed every mystery had a logical answer. By the time Jonas realized he was wrong, it was far too late. Jonas arrived in Black Hollow just before sundown, his car rattling as it pulled into the only road leading into town. He was used to remote places. He'd investigated urban legends, haunted towns, disappearances. But Black Hollow felt different. The air smelled wrong. Not salty, not fresh, stale, like something had been dead in the water for centuries. The villagers watched him with empty eyes. Their faces were weathered by more than just time. There was fear behind their expressions. Passing through, an old fisherman asked as Jonas stepped out of his car. No, Jonas replied, smiling. Actually, I'm here to write a story about the Screaming Tide. The villagers froze. For a long, painful moment, no one spoke. Then, one by one, they turned and walked away. Only the old fisherman remained. His face was grim, his eyes reflecting something ancient. He leaned closer. You should leave before the tide comes in, he whispered. Jonas chuckled. I've been to places like this before. The ocean's loud, the cliffs amplify the sound, and the wind carries it. That's all it is, right? The fisherman didn't blink. You think it's just the wind, he asked. Wait until the tide starts whispering your name. Jonas felt a sudden chill. But he shook it off and checked into the town's only inn. He set up his recording equipment by the window, making sure he had a perfect view of the ocean. He was going to capture the Screaming Tide. Then the sun went down. At midnight, Jonas sat by the window, staring at the black ocean. The tide was rising. The waves slithered up the shore, foaming and hissing. And then, the screams began. Jonas had expected something eerie. Maybe the wail of wind through sea caves, or the echo of waves against the cliffs. But this was different. It was human. Hundreds of voices. Thousands. Crying. Pleading. Screaming in agony. Jonas froze. His hands trembled as he reached for his recorder. He had never heard anything like this. Not in any haunted town. Not in any folklore. And then, one voice broke through the chaos. A whisper. Soft. Deliberate. It called his name. Jonas. His blood turned to ice. The voice came from the ocean. Not from the town. Not from his mind. It came from the waves. Jonas slammed the window shut. His breath was shallow, his pulse hammering. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had discovered his name and was playing a prank. But no one in Black Hollow spoke to outsiders. And the ocean does not know your name, unless you've already been claimed. The next morning, Jonas barely slept. He reviewed his recording from the night before. He expected static. He expected distortion. What he didn't expect was a voice whispering directly into the microphone. Jonas, come closer. It was so clear, so impossibly close, as if someone had been standing beside him. But there had been no one in the room. Jonas needed answers. He went back to the fisherman who had warned him. This time, the old man was waiting. Did you hear it? The fisherman asked quietly. Jonas swallowed. It said my name. The fisherman's face darkened. You need to leave. Now. Not until you tell me what's happening, Jonas said. The fisherman hesitated. Then, with a deep sigh, he motioned for Jonas to follow him. He led him to a weathered plaque near the cliffs. It was carved into the rock itself. Jonas read the names. Dozens of them. Hundreds. They were the names of the lost. Every year, the tide takes one of us, the fisherman said. The ocean calls their name. And when they answer, they're gone. Jonas stared at the list of names. Some were from decades ago. Some from last year. Then he saw the last name. His stomach turned to stone. Because at the very bottom, freshly carved into the rock, was his own name. Jonas Run. The wind howled. The tide screamed. And from the waves, he swore he heard laughter. The carved letters of his name on the rock seemed to breathe. Jonas stared in horror. It wasn't possible. No one knew he was coming to Black Hollow. He hadn't spoken his full name aloud since arriving. Yet here it was, etched into the stone, among the hundreds of others who had vanished into the screaming tide. A cold wind howled past, carrying the distant wails of the ocean. Jonas swallowed hard, forcing his journalistic instincts to override his fear. This is some kind of ritual, he muttered, turning to the fisherman. A hoax. You carve names into the stone to scare people away. The old man shook his head. That name wasn't there yesterday. Jonas's stomach tightened. Something invisible pressed against his mind, like fingers dragging through his thoughts. A deep, ancient hunger. And then, the tide screamed. The fisherman grabbed Jonas's arm. You have to leave. Before nightfall. Jonas pulled away, forcing himself to stay rational. It's just water. Just wind. Just sound. The fisherman's expression was grim. You think so? Then go. Stand at the shore tonight. Look into the waves. Listen. You'll understand. Jonas nodded. He would. He wasn't going to be scared away by old stories. But as he turned away, he caught one last glimpse of the carved rock. His name was deeper now. Fresher. As if the ocean itself had written it. Jonas set up his recording equipment at the shoreline. He stood alone, staring at the endless black water. The tide had receded, revealing dozens of jagged stones slick with seaweed and foam. The town behind him was dark. Silent. Everyone was locked inside, waiting for the screams to begin. Jonas checked his watch. 11:57 p.m. Then, as the clock struck midnight, the tide rushed in, and the screaming began. The air shook with the force of 1,000 voices. The screams weren't coming from the wind, nor the cliffs. They were coming from the water itself. Jonas's pulse hammered. He forced himself to listen, really listen. The voices weren't just wailing. They were begging. Some sobbed for their mothers. Some shrieked in agony. Others whispered things that made Jonas's blood turn to ice. And then, beneath the layers of torment, a single voice rose above the rest. Not in pain, not in fear, but in laughter. a low, gurgling chuckle that rolled through the tide like distant thunder. Jonas took a step back. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he couldn't, not yet. His microphone was picking up something. A second layer of sound. A voice beneath the screams. Something speaking. Jonas adjusted his headphones. His hands were shaking. The whisper was faint, distorted, almost too low to hear. But as he increased the volume, his breath caught in his throat. Because the voice was saying his name. Jonas. Jonas. Come closer. Jonas staggered backward, his boots sinking into the wet sand. His instincts were right. He wasn't just listening to the tide. The tide was listening to him, and it wanted him closer. Jonas turned to run. But then, a movement in the water stopped him. The ocean, once an endless black void, was now reflecting something unnatural. Jonas's own reflection stood in the water. But it wasn't right. It was smiling. He wasn't. He lifted his hand. His reflection did not. It simply watched him, grinning wider. Its eyes were too large, too dark, filled with an ancient hunger. Then slowly it raised a single, dripping hand and waved. Jonas stumbled backward. The sand beneath him sucked at his boots. The water rushed forward. Too fast, too sudden. His reflection was no longer alone. Dozens of twisted, grinning figures surfaced in the waves. Their mouths stretched unnaturally wide, and they were all waving at him. Jonas turned and ran. The sand was too soft, too deep. He felt himself sinking with every step. Behind him, the screams turned to laughter. The ocean was laughing at him. A wave crashed over his legs, pulling him toward the water. Hands, asterisk, asterisk, too many hands, asterisk, asterisk, brushed against his ankles, pulling, dragging. He clawed at the sand, kicking violently. He wouldn't go into the tide. He refused. Then, a lantern's glow cut through the darkness. The fisherman stood at the cliff's edge, watching. Jonas screamed, begging for help. But the old man only shook his head. "You shouldn't have listened," he whispered. Jonas felt something cold curl around his wrist. Something slimy. Hungry. The voices in the water grew louder. Then, darkness. Jonas felt weightless. A cold, crushing force wrapped around him, pulling him downward. He opened his mouth to scream, but the ocean flooded in, silencing him instantly. The water was thick, wrong, like it was more than just liquid. It clung to his skin like writhing fingers, seeping into his ears, pressing against his eyes. The world above him blurred into darkness. The lantern light from the fisherman was gone. The shore was gone. The sky, the stars, everything had vanished. Jonas was sinking into nothingness, the laughter of the tide vibrating through his bones. His lungs burned. He thrashed, but there was no resistance, no surface to push against. It felt like the water stretched endlessly, yet he was sinking too fast. Shapes drifted in the distance, shadowy figures floating just beyond his reach. Their movements were sluggish, unnatural, as if they weren't swimming but rather suspended in some invisible current. Jonas blinked, his vision hazy, his chest tightening. The figures were getting closer. Then he saw their faces. Twisted grins, stretched too wide, their teeth glinting like broken glass. Eyes black and bottomless, locked onto him with inhuman hunger. Their skin was pale, waterlogged, shifting unnaturally in the deep. Jonas tried to scream again, but the water swallowed his voice. They were all whispering his name over and over, their mouths moving in eerie synchronization. Jonas, Jonas, Jonas. Something brushed against his leg, then his arm. Fingers, dozens of them, grasping, pulling, dragging him deeper. He struggled, his body growing weaker with every second. The water pressed harder against him, squeezing his ribs like a vice. The pressure in his skull built to a piercing pain. Then, between the shifting bodies, he saw it. A massive shape loomed in the abyss. A mouth, no, an opening, gaped in the darkness, lined with jagged, rock-like teeth. It wasn't a creature. It was the ocean itself, wide open and waiting. The tide had brought him home. Jonas's mind fractured. His body convulsed. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him whole was his own reflection staring back at him from the abyss. It was smiling. Black Hollow never spoke of what happened to the outsider. They never acknowledged the empty room, the untouched belongings, the recording equipment left behind. The fisherman, like the rest of the town, simply continued with his quiet existence. The ocean does not return what it takes. But the next night, when the tide rolled in, the screams were louder than ever. And among them, a new voice joined the chorus. A voice that whispered a single name: Jonas. But the horrors of the ocean do not end here. Because sometimes, the water doesn't just hide its secrets. Sometimes it speaks. And when it does, it whispers names, calling out to those who dare to listen. But be warned, those who hear the call of the tide are never seen again. This is the story of the drowned ones. The ocean holds many secrets. Some are buried beneath the waves, lost to time. Others refuse to stay forgotten. The town of Ravenshore sat on the edge of an uncharted abyss, a place where the ocean floor plunged deeper than any map dared to show. Fishermen whispered of strange tides, of boats that drifted too far and never returned. But the true horror wasn't what lay beneath the surface. It was what came back. Legends spoke of the drowned ones. They were sailors, explorers, and unlucky souls who had vanished into the sea's black embrace, only to return, not as men, but as something else. Creatures that wore the faces of the lost, moving with jerky, unnatural precision. Their skin was always wet, their eyes dark pits of hunger. They never spoke. They only knocked. And once they knocked, you were already dead. Samuel Gray never believed the stories. As a marine researcher, he spent years studying the Ravenshore Trench, mapping its impossible depths. Unlike the superstitious fishermen, he saw the ocean as a vast, unexplored frontier, not a graveyard of cursed souls. That was until his brother disappeared. Daniel Gray had been one of the best deep-sea divers on the East Coast. He knew the waters better than anyone. When he set out on a private expedition to the Ravenshore Trench, no one expected him to vanish. The Coast Guard searched for weeks. Nothing. No distress signal. No wreckage. No body. Samuel refused to accept it. Daniel was still out there. He had to be. So when a stormy night brought a lone, waterlogged figure back to shore, Samuel thought his prayers had been answered. He was wrong. The rain pounded against Samuel's window as he sat in his darkened office, drowning in old research files and whiskey. His brother's empty diving suit sat in the corner, still damp from the last time Daniel had worn it. The room smelled of salt and regret. Then, at exactly midnight, there was a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not hurried, not uncertain. They carried a weight that sent a shiver crawling up Samuel's spine. He wasn't expecting anyone. For a long moment, he sat frozen, his heart hammering. The wind howled outside, the ocean roaring in the distance. Then came the 4th knock. Something about it made Samuel's skin crawl. His fingers twitched toward the drawer where he kept his hunting knife. He rose, moving cautiously toward the door. Through the peephole, he saw nothing but darkness. No shape, no figure. Just the storm raging outside. Then, as lightning split the sky, he saw it. A man stood at his doorstep, soaking wet, motionless. Samuel's breath caught. His face was hidden in shadow, but the shape, the broad shoulders, the way he stood, it was impossibly familiar. Samuel's throat tightened. He unlocked the door with trembling fingers and swung it open. The man stepped forward, rain dripping from his tattered clothes. Samuel's stomach twisted. It was Daniel. Or at least, it looked like Daniel. His brother did not speak. He stood there, unmoving, his wet clothes clinging to his skin. His hair hung in soaked strands over his forehead, his lips slightly parted, as if he had forgotten how to breathe. Samuel swallowed hard. Daniel. No response. His skin was too pale. His eyes wrong. They were pitch black, like the ocean depths. No whites, no pupils. Just endless voids. Samuel took a step back. Where the hell have you been? Daniel did not blink. Water dripped from his fingers. His chest did not rise or fall with breath. Samuel felt his pulse hammer in his skull. His brother should have been dead. But here he was. And something was terribly, terribly wrong. He took another step back. "Daniel, what happened to you?" The thing wearing his brother's face tilted its head slightly. Water spilled from its mouth, trickling down its chin like black ink. Then, in a voice that did not belong to Daniel, it spoke. "Let me in." The words sent ice through Samuel's veins. Daniel's voice had always been warm, full of life. This voice was hollow, distant, like something was speaking from deep underwater. Samuel's instincts screamed at him. "Close the door. Lock it. Run." But his feet wouldn't move. Daniel took a step forward. His soaked boots left no footprints on the wooden floor. The storm raged behind him, but not a single raindrop touched him anymore. Samuel's breath hitched. You're not my brother." Daniel's jaw unhinged slightly, as if he was about to speak again. More water spilled out. But then, slowly, he smiled. A smile that stretched too wide, splitting his lips at the corners. His black eyes gleamed, something inhuman shifting beneath the surface. Then came the second voice. Not Daniel's. Not even human. It came from inside him. From the depths of his chest, gurgling and thick, like seawater bubbling up through shattered lungs. "You should have let me drown." Samuel's stomach lurched. The air grew heavy, pressing down on him like the weight of the ocean itself. The house around him seemed to darken, warp, breathe. Then, in a single, unnatural motion, Daniel lunged. Samuel slammed the door shut. The lock clicked. His breath came in ragged gasps. The knocking began again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Then silence. Samuel backed away, gripping the knife so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't move for hours. When the first light of dawn crept through his window, he finally found the courage to look outside. The storm was gone, and so was Daniel. All that remained on his doorstep was a puddle of black water, still rippling, as if something had just crawled back into the depths. Samuel never spoke of that night. But the knocking returned, every year, on the anniversary of Daniel's disappearance. And each time the voice grew clearer. "Let me in. The ocean is not kind to those who refuse to forget." Samuel tried to move on. He tried to convince himself that it was a hallucination, that grief had twisted his mind into seeing things that weren't real. But deep down, he knew the truth. Daniel had come back that night. Or at least something had. The problem was it never left. The knocking continued. Always at midnight. Always in sets of 3. Sometimes he'd wake up gasping, convinced he had dreamt it, only to find the wooden floor near the door soaked. The ocean was calling for him, and it was getting closer. Samuel wasn't the only one who had seen the drowned ones. There were others. James Carter was a fisherman, well respected in Ravenshore, until the night he vanished. It started just like Samuel's experience. 3 knocks at the door. His wife, Ellen, woke up to find him standing in the living room, staring at the front door with wide, unblinking eyes. "James," she whispered. He didn't respond. The clock read 11:59 p.m. Ellen watched as James slowly raised his hand and unlocked the door. She barely caught a glimpse of the figure outside. A man, soaking wet, standing unnaturally still. His features were twisted, distorted, as though the water had eaten away at his flesh. The door swung open. Ellen screamed. James walked forward without hesitation, like a man possessed. The moment he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut. When Ellen managed to wrench it back open, James was gone. All that remained was a trail of wet footprints leading straight into the ocean. His body was never found. The story of James Carter only confirmed Samuel's worst fears. The drowned ones were real, and they were taking people. For months, Samuel tried to ignore the knocking. He avoided the door, never opened it, never looked outside. But it didn't stop. Some nights, he would wake up to the sound of water dripping inside his house, despite all the taps being off. Other nights, he'd hear his brother's voice whispering from the other side of the door. "Sam, let me in." And then, one night, the whispers moved closer. Samuel woke to a cold breath on his neck. The door was still locked. The windows were shut. But the air in his room was thick with the smell of salt water and decay. He wasn't safe anymore. The ocean was inside now. Desperate for answers, Samuel turned to the only place he hadn't dared to go: the Ravenshore Trench. If Daniel had truly returned from the depths, then the answers were buried in the abyss. With a diving crew hesitant but willing, he chartered a boat and set out into the midnight waters. They dropped anchor at the coordinates of Daniel's last known dive. The sonar showed nothing but endless black below. Samuel descended first. The water swallowed him whole, and the deeper he went, the quieter the world became. 50 meters. The ocean above was still visible, the boat a distant shadow. 100 meters. The light from the surface began to fade. 200 meters. The world turned to darkness. His oxygen hissed. The weight of the deep pressed against his skull. But something else was down here. Then he saw them. Drifting in the abyss, motionless bodies hung in the water like forgotten marionettes. Their eyes were open, their mouths slightly parted. Their fingers twitched in slow, unnatural movements. Samuel's stomach twisted. He recognized their faces. The lost ones. James Carter. The fishermen. The sailors. Daniel. Their bodies were preserved in the freezing depths. But they weren't dead. They were waiting. Then, in the distance, the water moved. Something massive shifted in the trench. Samuel's breath hitched. His flashlight flickered over the abyss. A shape, impossibly large, stirred in the blackness. It wasn't a creature. It was the ocean itself. It had eyes, and it was watching him. Something grabbed his ankle. Samuel screamed into his regulator, kicking violently. A cold, slimy hand wrapped around his leg, pulling him downward. He shone his light below. Daniel was there. His face was empty, devoid of anything human. His mouth moved, whispering through the water, though no sound came. Samuel struggled, but more hands emerged from the darkness, gripping his arms, wrapping around his neck, dragging him down. The abyss opened beneath him, yawning like a hungry mouth. Samuel's vision blurred. His oxygen tank was running low. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Then, in the distant black, a figure moved toward him. Not Daniel. Not a drowned one. Something worse. The source of the knocking. The thing that took them all. Samuel screamed. The last thing he saw was a face that wasn't human, grinning in the depths, its teeth endless and jagged. And then, the ocean swallowed him whole. Silence. That was all Samuel knew. The weight of the ocean pressed against him, dragging him deeper into the abyss. His lungs burned, his limbs grew numb, and the last bubbles of his breath vanished into the black void above him. The figures surrounded him. The drowned ones, their faces frozen in empty expressions, their eyes black pits of nothingness. They swayed in the current, watching, but not moving, like puppets waiting for unseen strings to pull them. And then something stirred. The darkness itself moved. Samuel's mind screamed, every primal instinct in his body telling him to run, but there was nowhere to go. He was already gone. Then came the knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. But they weren't coming from his door anymore. They were coming from inside his head. The town of Ravenshore was quiet that morning. The waves lapped lazily at the shore, the storm long gone. The sky was clear, as if nothing had ever happened. But something had. At precisely 3:47 a.m., the fishing cruise boat had returned to the harbor. Empty. Samuel Gray was gone. The crew could barely remember what had happened. They only recalled flashes, strange lights in the water, radio static that sounded like voices whispering through broken teeth. Then their memories simply stopped. The Coast Guard conducted a search, but they never found a body. A week passed. Then, one night, at exactly midnight, there was a knock at Samuel Gray's front door. 3 knocks. Then silence. Ellen Carter had seen what happened to her husband, James. She knew better than to open the door. But that night, the knocking came again. Slow. Deliberate. Then a voice, faint as a dying tide. "Ellen, it's me." Her blood ran cold. It wasn't James. She knew that. She had seen him walk into the ocean, his body claimed by the abyss. But the voice outside was identical. Her hands trembled. She squeezed her eyes shut, whispering a desperate prayer. The knocking stopped. But then, something began scratching at the windows. She held her breath. Her heart pounded so violently she thought it would break through her ribs. Then the voice returned, closer. "Ellen, please let me in. I'm so cold." She couldn't help herself. Her eyes flicked toward the window. And that's when she saw it. A wet, discolored hand pressed against the glass. Its fingers too long, too thin, the skin pale and pruned, like something that had been underwater for far too long. Then the face. James. Or at least something wearing his face. His skin was stretched too tight over his bones. His lips curved into an unnatural grin. And his eyes. His eyes were bottomless black pits. A scream caught in Ellen's throat. She tore her gaze away and ran to the closet, throwing herself inside, her body trembling as she covered her ears. Outside, the knocking continued. 3 knocks. Again. And again. And then, after what felt like an eternity, silence. By dawn, the footprints outside her window had vanished. But the puddle of black water remained. The town of Ravenshore no longer speaks of the drowned ones. Too many people have disappeared. Too many houses have been found with doors left open, footprints leading to the shore and never coming back. The ocean does not give back what it takes. And yet, some nights, the lost return. Not as men, not as ghosts, but as something else. And if you ever hear 3 knocks at midnight, do not open the door, no matter how familiar the voice sounds. Because once you do, the ocean will never let you go.